On the cusp of the 1980s, Moonraker follows Star Wars into space with stratospheric success.
Thank you for the ride.
Moonraker becomes a ginormous worldwide hit, grossing over $200 million.
Trifle overpowering.
Helping make United Artists the most powerful studio of the 1970s.
The idea that the studio would somehow falter was inconceivable.
You don't believe me, do you?
But the 1980s would be blown in on the winds of change.
United Artists had hit a wall.
And the competition was getting fiercer and fiercer.
He said, I think this series has run its course, don't you?
And everyone panicked.
But if Bond was to die another day, Cubby Broccoli would need an ace up his sleeve.
Would you go see a film entitled Octopussy?
Have you gone mad?
Well, perhaps something a little bit more substantial than that.
It was time to shake things up. It was time for a new Bond.
With the hunt for their new spy underway,
We were getting close to when we had to start. We were getting pretty desperate.
there would need to be a new Bond for a new era.
James Bond goes rogue.
And with the tightening grip of the studio,
We were getting a lot of pressure to cut down on the cost of our films.
That could have been disastrous.
everything was on the line.
We had 4 minutes to make him the new Bond.
In 1979, producer Cubby Broccoli was over the moon with the success of Moonraker. However, for those in Bond's orbit, it was impossible to ignore United Artists' freefall.
The original leadership team that had led the United Artists through the 60s and 70s, they all leave in the late 1970s.
The studio, owned by a big insurance monolith, Transamerica Corporation.
You know, they wanted more control.
Senior Vice President Mike Metaboy had seen enough.
I decided, hey, I'm not gonna stay. It was a terrible time. You know, it's the old thing about people who don't know anything about the business. They're just numbers people.
Also referred to as
Bean counters.
and with the bean counters in charge, no one was safe from their penny pinching.
The future of the Bond films was kept on edge. It was no longer a bottomless pit of money.
Meanwhile, the instability at United Artists helped push Cubby Broccoli into a creative decision that he had been contemplating since the release of Moonraker.
Cubby wanted to, as he said, pull in the balloon a little bit.
After all, there's not much further Bond can go than space.
He said we need to literally bring Bond down to Earth after being in outer space.
That's when they came up with the story of For Your Eyes Only.
A far more grounded tale of missile-commanded systems and murdered marine biologists.
An official operation was out of the question.
Bond teams up with the victim's vengeful daughter
Always avenge their loved ones.
to defeat the villain
I never go back on a deal.
and save the day.
Which kind of harkens back to a From Russia with Love type story. A little bit more cloak and daggery.
Feels like the restart of Bond as a more grounded character.
But after the success of Moonraker, would audiences take to this fresh start?
Why not?
It was a big risk. And to make it even riskier,
Incredibly, they decided that if they were going to make a fresh start, they might as well start with a fresh director.
well, fresh-ish. Enter John Glenn.
I had worked on James Bond films, 3 as editor and second unit director.
John, of course, had filmed that great opening sequence in The Spy Who Loved Me, with Bond parachuting off the top of the mountain.
It was a little bit more than that.
That was considered one of the greatest stunts in the history of cinema.
And so if anyone deserved the gig, it was John Glenn.
It was just really a natural progression, and Cubby had the faith in him to take over a whole film.
I think Cubby was quite shrewd because I was young. He was hoping probably I would give the film a lift, you know, and make it current to the younger people.
And the first challenge for this new director was recasting Bond. No pressure.
Every time, every film, he was on a film-by-film basis, so every film it was all a bit of a toss-up whether he'd come back or not.
If I can stay awake when I'm reading a script, you know,
It amuses me, and everything is there, all the elements are right. Yes, I do them.
Yeah.
And one of those elements, of course, was money. Roger Moore had earned $4 million for his portrayal of Bond in Moonraker. But the bean counters at United Artists weren't going to pay that sort of money. Until, that is, they did a little risk analysis.
There's nothing so risky as recasting a James Bond.
Having learned that from this guy.
I wouldn't sign their contract.
So what commenced was a Bond-like game of cat and mouse to convince Moore to sign on the cheap.
The famous story goes that Roger and Cubby would play backgammon for Roger's salary.
That game went on all the time.
They would dangle other actors who will replace you.
Names like Oliver Tobias, Michael Billington.
However, in the end, Roger Moore, like his character, called Broccoli's bluff.
Lucky night.
And Broccoli agreed to pay Roger $4.6 million to come back.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
He held it against me slightly that I'd been testing other possible Bonds, but he forgave me very quickly. Didn't hold a grudge, Roger.
Oh, I'm very grateful. I'm always amazed when I get another job offer.
And joining Roger and John Glenn on set would be another veteran, of sorts. Cubby's daughter, Barbara Broccoli.
She gets in there and she is busting her tail, and she's working with as many departments as she can.
Having worked in publicity for The Spy Who Loved Me and as second AD on Moonraker, she was bouncing around every department on set.
And so she knows how films are made as she's coming up through the ranks.
It really was great training for her.
Standing next to John Glenn every day, she got to watch a master at work.
He was at a friend's home and saw a child using a remote control helicopter and said, let's put that in the film.
You are now flying remote control airways.
He gets Remy Julien, a French car expert, to do amazing stunts, notably with the Citroën de Chauffeur.
I'm afraid we're being out-horsepowered.
But we put it a very big engine in the 2CV, and it was much powerful.
But John's greatest stunts would be driven by pigeon power.
Bond's climbing this precipice and he puts his hand into a handhold, and then, of course, a pigeon flies out. Makes the audience miss a heartbeat. You know, it became a trademark of mine.
And a favorite among the bean counters.
They're cheap and they're freely available anywhere in the world.
But exhausting the pigeon budget wouldn't be enough to stave off United Artists' money troubles, because they had one movie.
Heaven's Gate.
That was becoming a very big problem.
That was it. That was the one.
Making merely $3.5 million at the box office. For United Artists, Heaven's Gate was more a nail in the coffin.
A movie loses the biggest amount of money ever lost in any movie up until that time, forcing Transamerica Corporation, the parent company, to sell its ownership in United Artists.
United Artists was sinking, and fast.
They sell it to the billionaire property magnate Kurt Kerkorian.
Kirk was a real gentleman, nice person, but he was a total business guy. You know, he should never have been running a movie company, although he wanted to.
But this wasn't Kerkorian's first movie studio venture. In fact, Kerkorian also owned MGM.
And merges United Artists effectively with his ownership of the studio, MGM.
Meaning, basically, that James Bond had a new studio and Cubby Broccoli had a new partner.
MGM know that the Bond films are reliable. Even the Bond films that do less well are still profitable.
For Your Eyes Only is released in 1981 and becomes a massive success with a box office return second only to Moonraker.
The public loved it, and I was very happy.
Immediately, the team turned to the next film. Roger Moore again was looking for a boost to his salary.
How much money does MGM want to spend on Roger Moore to come back?
Now in his 50s, there was another issue.
We're going to start having old man Bond.
An issue that couldn't be ignored, even in the movies themselves.
You get your clothes on. I'll buy you an ice cream.
Even though BB Doll expresses interest in James Bond, he says, no, like, you're too young. This is inappropriate.
It was beginning to look like Bond would be Roger no more. However, there was another age-old issue that far predated Roger Moore's, because Ian Fleming's very own Bond villain was back.
Kevin McClory won the rights to Thunderball against the court case with Ian Fleming.
But it didn't end there. Because, as you'll remember,
10 years after Thunderball the movie, he would get the rights back and would be able to remake that film.
which is exactly what he planned to do. And he had one gigantic ace in the hole to make it work. One Mr. Sean Connery.
Kevin McClory is very clever. He says to Sean Connery, I want you to help me write the next James Bond film. And Sean Connery had writing ambitions. I don't want you to play James Bond, I want you to be able to write it.
With that, Connery was back in.
All right, let's get down to business.
And MGM's doubts about Roger Moore?
Roger Moore looked a little bit old.
Wasn't such a big problem after all.
That's the point they said. We can't have an unknown Bond competing against the best known Bond, Sean Connery.
The Battle of the Bonds was just beginning. In 1982, the Battle of the Bonds was on.
My name is Bond.
Well, of course you are. We felt under increasing pressure from the studio heads at that time.
But don't forget, McClory had made a deal with Connery.
I don't want you to play James Bond, I want you to be able to write it. That production is announced as Warhead, with Orson Welles as Blofeld.
They've got mechanical sharks attacking New York.
But it was soon a feeding frenzy for the lawyers.
Technically and legally, McClory didn't have the right to remake the film of Thunderball. What he had was the right to make another adaptation of this screenplay worked on with Ian Fleming.
Sean Connery's script was tossed out faster than you could say 007. And for Kevin McClory, the message was clear.
We're gonna remake Thunderball.
So, back to square one, and with a different writer. McClory's new Thunderball script, ironically retitled Never Say Never Again, would still star the Bond who said he would never play James Bond again.
He agrees to do Never Say Never Again for a sizable chunk of the gross, plus a $5 million upfront fee.
So again, Connery would be James Bond at the same time that Roger Moore would be James Bond.
Both those films, they have no earthly idea how this is gonna play out.
Well, it was time to find out, with the mildly salacious title, Octopussy. Cubby Broccoli, John Glenn, and Roger Moore headed to India.
We said, well, the Bonds have never been to India.
And this time, Barbara Broccoli and her stepbrother, Michael G. Wilson, would have even bigger roles.
This wasn't blind nepotism. They had to earn it.
In fact, lots of people say Michael Wilson is treated a lot harder by being the producer's stepson than were he a stranger.
And working in India, Michael was working very hard indeed.
When you see the tennis racket and the bad guy with the big 3 blades hitting like this, you see a bicycle coming from a road, going through between the two tuk-tuk. It's somebody who came from nowhere. It was pretty funny and scary.
But Roger Moore could go one better than 3 wheels.
It was a special Mercedes we make with the wheels on the roof and a wheel on the bottom of the car. So he was driving the cars on 2 wheels. He was driving by himself.
But it wouldn't be a true John Glenn-directed Bond movie if it wasn't for pigeons.
You're the pigeon wrangler. I said, oh, thanks. Stand by. It's a pigeon, 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 pigeon. I'm on my box underneath the camera, and just as he goes across, I throw the pigeons up, and all the dust goes up, and an egg comes down, hits me on the head, and goes down my face. Roger's in hysterics. The crew's in hysterics. But that was Roger. He was pulling gags and going out of his way to make the crew laugh.
Meanwhile, to avoid having egg on his face, Kevin McClory and his competing movie had an extra $10 million more to spend than Octopussy. And boy, he intended to use it.
The production of Never Say Never Again was a mess.
And if anyone should know, it's this chap, Paul Tucker. He was the production accountant.
We had 5 different crews. We had an underwater crew, aerial crew, we had second unit, the main unit, splinter unit, like 5 films working on one film. Didn't have a sort of a continuity of the Cubby Broccoli films. It wasn't quite as organised.
Beginning with the script.
The opening scene was originally going to be a jousting scene.
But due to delays and some bad weather, the team needed a new opening, and they needed it fast.
The writers had to come up with a new scene, and they were flown out with the crew to the Bahamas, and they came up with this terrorist-type scene, which opened the film. That was done very off the cuff.
And things didn't improve as the film wrapped, with Kevin McClory's film ending up in enemy hands.
One day his rushes arrived. By mistake, they got mixed up which Bond it was, and we even paid for a car to deliver the rushes back. I didn't look at them, I promise you, I just sent them back.
Well, it seemed that for the Never Say Never Again team, maybe no one was watching the rushes.
The first running we had of that film, we all sat back, and the two writers said, "Why did Bond go to the Bahamas?" And we all looked at one another and said, "Yeah, why did he go?" Because there was nothing in the film to say why he went, and everyone panicked.
There was a meeting about having to do some additional photography.
And having been stripped of writing duties, Connery saw another way to get behind the camera.
Sean's reply was, "I'll be directing those scenes." And we reshot those scenes with Kim Basinger.
But it helped put the film under pressure, and indeed behind schedule, which affected its release.
Several months behind John Glenn and Octopussy, who beat McClory and Connery to the cinemas, making $187 million against its $27 million budget.
They just made themselves a very solid 1980s James Bond film.
Spend the money quickly, Mr. Bond. I intend to.
John Glenn was solidifying his reputation as the Bond director of choice in this new era, with Glenn expanding his signature move from pigeons to tigers. It was enough to scare McClory and Connery.
The other film, I think they very wisely decided to defer it, and they didn't want to go head-to-head with us, which was a wise move, I think.
However, the performance of Never Say Never Again would surprise everyone. When Never Say Never Again is released, it creates history.
Sean Connery's picture opens with the biggest opening weekend of a Bond film in cinema history of over $9 million, and is a huge critical smash.
Good show, James.
A lot of critics welcome Connery back.
With his stunt-driven, effects-driven, set-piece-driven style, the audiences like it. It grosses very well internationally.
However, there's just one stumbling point.
Does less well than Octopussy.
Never Say Never Again rakes in an impressive $160 million at the box office, nearly $30 million shy of Octopussy's $187 million. Close, but no cigar.
No, I'm not going to play it again.
As for McClory, his rendezvous with Bond didn't end here, but that's another battle for another time. And as for the old...
We're going to start having old man Bond.
Problem? Cubby Broccoli? Oh, he had no such concerns with Roger Moore.
Roger Moore is announced as playing James Bond for a 7th time in A View to a Kill.
It's got some incredible stunt work that goes on in there. You know, you've got an opening ski sequence. Is going great until the cover of the Beach Boys song comes in. That dive off the Eiffel Tower. And then they actually put 2 stuntmen atop the Golden Gate Bridge and had them doing some fighting up there.
And you see all the traffic below you going 2 lanes of traffic. It was just fantastic.
But arguably, the movie's best performance wasn't from Roger Moore.
Mayday, played by Grace Jones. She has this inhuman strength. You know, Bond sleeps with her, but Bond's kind of afraid of her and not vice versa. And she is the only woman villain who chooses how she dies. It's really on her terms and not on his.
And on A View to a Kill's release, it was clear the age-old age question had found new life.
Critics said, he's a little long in the tooth to be playing James Bond.
I think the studio wanted a new Bond. I don't think there was a whole lot of struggle over that.
It was a mutual decision. Roger Moore was almost 60 years old if he was making another Bond film.
Would you like it harder?
James, you haven't changed.
And Roger, he felt uncomfortable doing A View to a Kill because he's in his mid-50s and he's traipsing around with some girl in her 20s or something. And they knew if they had to rejuvenate it for a new era and a new audience.
They had to tell Roger it's time.
After 7 films, the beloved actor who once saved the franchise from an uncertain future and turned it into a billion-dollar behemoth, sipped his final martini.
I'm really not a vodka drinker. I prefer Jack Daniels, a man's drink.
It was time to shake things up. It was time for a new Bond.
Shaken or stirred, one thing was for sure, there would be more James Bond without Roger Moore. And Cubby wasted no time beginning work on a film called The Living Daylights, inspired by one of Ian Fleming's last unadapted writings. But who would play Bond?
And they went through a bunch of names.
From Sam Neill
My friends call me Bond. James Bond.
to Mel Gibson.
There's a money issue there. He was one of the world's biggest stars.
But there was another actor waiting in the wings who played the title character in the popular television show Remington Steele.
Phone call for Remington Steele.
Miss?
In 1985, NBC's detective procedural Remington Steele was growing cold in the ratings, but its Irish star, Pierce Brosnan, was piping hot.
Pierce Brosnan, because of Remington Steele, had this kind of Bond persona that existed.
Pearson. Ben Pearson.
Special agent.
Cool under pressure, can dress very well, very elegant, very masculine.
Pretty good at this sort of thing.
They felt they had somebody there that they could make into James Bond.
But as fate would have it, Remington Steele was yet to be renewed, and Brosnan was about to become a free agent.
However, there's one fly in the ointment. There is a 60-day clause for the show to be renewed if they could find new backers.
They just had to wait for the contract with NBC to expire. That was it.
Cubby took the gamble and cast Brosnan, but it was mum's the word for 60 days to prevent any outside interference from souring the deal.
What is this fetish you have for secrecy? Anonymity is an asset in my profession.
Unfortunately, they played that hand as well as they could play it.
But not quite well enough.
Industry insiders had a pretty strong clue that he would be the next James Bond. Ironically, that renewed interest in Remington Steele.
NBC looked at it and said, oh, if he can be James Bond, we can exercise the Pierce Brosnan's Remington Steele contract.
And exercise it, they did. With merely days to spare, NBC renewed Remington Steele.
Pierce was angry. He went on People magazine. He said, take this job and shove it.
There was a lot of pain, a lot of sadness there, anger, because you really felt that you were just manipulated, you know, and, you know, the people who did it, just short people, you know, and they know who they are.
But the short people had their way.
Put him out of the running.
But it wasn't just Pierce Brosnan who was put out.
We were getting close to when we had to start. We were already in preparation at Pinewood. We were making sets and things, and pretty desperate to find someone because we had to really make the film. I happened to mention Timothy Dalton, and he'd had a huge success on his first film.
The Lion in Winter, 1968, were the first film. You could see great things. The raw talent was there.
He was a Shakespearean actor. He was probably overqualified for Bond, quite honestly, but Cubby, I wasn't that crazy about the idea.
As had been the case in casting Sean Connery, it was the other Broccoli's who helped him to see sense.
And Michael talked to Cubby about it.
Especially Broccoli's wife, Dana, who plucked Sean Connery from this little movie.
I'm sure you can see I need someone to watch over me.
And made him really big.
Dana Broccoli leaves the chance to get Timothy Dalton.
She told Cubby, Tim Dalton, he'd be fabulous. He looks like Fleming's creation.
Dalton certainly looked the part, and it sounded like he understood Bond as well.
What I liked about Fleming was the way he could make everybody identify with the situations Bond was in. which made Bond a real hero.
But would Dalton make a great Bond?
He got the job.
It was time to find out. In the fall of 1986, production of The Living Daylights began. The question was, could Timothy Dalton continue the legacy of iconic Bond actors?
Why me? He's under the impression you're the best.
Well, he was certainly going to try to be, with Dalton insisting on doing much of his own stunt work, which of course made pigeon wrangler / stunt coordinator Paul Wesley's job all that much harder.
He said he wanted to do as much of the action as possible,
which we weren't very happy about at the time.
It was a bit dangerous, but I had to trust him.
He said, I want to look right, I want to be James Bond, I want to look like James Bond.
Of course, he couldn't do it all on his own.
We had several doubles,
including this legend, Dominique Julien.
I was a Bond double to jump on the Jeep. The guy on the roof of the Jeep, it was me. All the close shot, he was on the roof, and all the large shot, I was on the roof. There was a big ravine on the side and everything, so I was a bit scary sometimes. I'm afraid of height. Not good for my job.
The stakes were high. If audiences didn't get on board with Dalton straight away, it could spell disaster for the picture.
We had 4 minutes to make him the new Bond.
The Land Rover crashes over a cliff, and Dalton's Bond manages to extract himself from the Land Rover using a parachute. It has to make an emergency landing on a boat down below. And John Glenn said this sequence, by the end of it, you had to believe the man was James Bond.
Who are you?
Bond, James Bond.
We did believe Timothy Dalton was James Bond. A James Bond like we'd never seen before.
And it wouldn't be long before audiences would see something else they'd never seen before in a Bond film.
To make Bond a one-woman person.
But how?
We'll manage.
Whoa, hold on. A fresh Bond is one thing.
Worried for you, James.
But to have a monogamous James Bond?
I guess it was the sign of the times, really. There was a great movement afoot in the press and everywhere else, and people from all over the world were so worried about AIDS, and so we thought we were doing the right thing at the time.
There's many times where a man and a woman get together in a Bond film, and I don't feel any connection, I don't feel any chemistry, and yet here I truly believe that the two of them are in love.
It was a huge risk to change a formula that had worked in 13 previous Bond films.
Take me around the world one more time.
And no small challenge for the actress taking on the role.
They cast the actress Mariam Darbo.
And where Cubby's wife Dana had influenced Sean Connery, and now Timothy Dalton's casting. Now it was Cubby's daughter, Barbara's turn.
Barbara Broccoli actually was a friend of hers, and she said, why didn't you meet her? And she came down to the studio one day and we met in Cubby's office.
Broccoli family, they all seem to become producers.
On The Living Daylights, Barbara Broccoli would be associate producer.
And we watch her emerge in casting, in music, in various capacities throughout the 80s.
In fact, the young Barbara Broccoli's emergence on the Bond scene was beginning to look like an aha moment for Cubby and John. And in this case, quite literally.
And that's how you get aha to write the song.
She dragged me down to Croydon to watch them in a concert. She was more in touch with what the youngsters, went for.
So with a new Bond, and a new Bond song, and a new take on Bond's polygamous behavior, Cubby and John Glenn would make sure The Living Daylights was still packed full of what fans had come to know and love.
The Aston Martin car chase on the frozen lake in Austria is a beloved scene for fans for many reasons.
Bringing back the iconic Aston Martin for the first time since the days of Lazenby. Hopefully, this would turn out better than the last time Bond drove one. There was one minor difference between the two cars.
We built the Aston Martin with dummy skids on it so that it looked as though it was all rigged. The Aston Martin had to drive into a wooden shed. Somebody fires a missile at it and it blows up. And we did all that for real.
But the most dangerous element wasn't the explosions. Rather, it was the location itself.
The frightening thing was, as you drove across the lake, the ice would be breaking.
The ice wasn't particularly reliable.
And it made the most extraordinary noises.
It went crack. And everyone tried to run, but you can't run on ice. It was quite funny.
On the day they did the car on the ice broke and we nearly lost the Aston Martin.
They might have nearly lost the car, but one producer on the set knew how to keep everyone afloat.
Barbara went out with bottles of brandy and giving them drinks. Barbara and Cubby always looked after the crew. They were wonderful people to work for.
And once the hangover ended, the crew went on to shoot the most iconic scene of the film.
Quick, go! Amongst the most memorable action sequence of The Living Daylights is Bond's escape from chasing Czech soldiers.
Glad I insisted you brought that cello.
I came up with this idea. I thought, well, the cello case, now how can we use that? And I thought about sliding it down the mountain.
Producer Cubby Broccoli had some sharp notes for John Glenn about that.
Cubby looked at me in disbelief, and he made a sort of a rude noise. He said no one could sit in a cello case.
But John Glenn, by now, was redefining the James Bond franchise and wouldn't be put off.
Cubby picked the phone up and asked for the music stage.
So they actually got a cello case into the office.
I got into one side of it and Cubby sat in the other side of it.
And showed that, you could run it like a two-person sled.
So we proved it was possible, and the idea was sold. We put two skis hidden underneath the cello case.
And then we put two almost like brake handles, one on either side, so that Tim and the stuntman could, to a degree, control the angle that they were going at. By pulling the levers, went down the ski slope. It was a fun ride, I tried it.
I love the cello chase.
And while the cello chase was a relatively straightforward scene to film,
we've nothing to declare!
The polar opposite would be the case for the film's biggest stunt.
If it doesn't work just right, I'd kill it.
John Glenn's action sequences were innovative, and Dalton was pulling them off. But it would be the final action sequence of the film that would leave audiences with a lasting impression as to whether Dalton was indeed a Bond for the future.
The signature action sequence of The Living Daylights is where Bond is battling on a cargo net, dangling out the back of a Hercules, fighting the henchperson Necros, played by ballet dancer Andreas Wisniewski.
I was a dancer, and somebody sent Eon Productions a picture. They invite me in, and I sort of slicked my hair back, and I looked like the character in the script, and that pretty much clinched it.
I've worked with the Russians. My appearance and methods are well known to them.
Like Dalton, his adversary was committed to making the film as realistic as possible.
I did all the stunts except for the parachuting stunt. That was obviously quite a dangerous stunt, and my stunt double was going to only use one parachute under this jacket.
The stunt double reluctantly agreed to put on a spare parachute before dropping 3,000 feet in the air.
And it was a good thing because that chute did not open, and he needed the spare chute to actually land safely. It would have been disastrous.
What the stunt people didn't envisage for was the fluctuation of the net that flew wildly up, hitting against the top fuselage of the plane.
And if it doesn't work just right, knock him unconscious. You can't pull your own ripcord if you're falling through the air and you're unconscious. It was serious stuff.
But back on the sound stages in England, there was a much lighter mood as the crew was expecting some special guests.
Prince Charles himself and Lady Diana were going to come down. It was around the time we would be shooting Q's workshop.
Assassination method, explosive teddy bears.
And John would have an explosive job for the king in waiting.
Somebody's got a radio that fires a missile, so we came up with the idea of Prince Charles firing the actual charges. And he was great. I mean, he was spot on.
Meanwhile, the princess had an idea of her own: revenge.
Lady Diana thought it was fascinating that they would use what was called at the time sugar glass in the industry. Like, here's a fake champagne bottle, here's a fake glass. We can throw a stuntman through glass.
We arranged with the special effects department to have a prop or bottle.
And they asked the princess if she wanted to break one over the prince's head.
I think Diana acted very well. She gave him a good blow to the head.
It was in all the papers everywhere because it summed up what everybody kind of believed about the tension that was going on in their marriage.
And hopefully that extra publicity would help. Because just 6 months later, in July of 1987, The Living Daylights hit the theaters. Cubby Broccoli and John Glenn held their breath, hoping Timothy Dalton would be a hit with the audiences, and that a one-woman Bond would still be Bond enough to ensure a big box office return.
I was very worried.
Critics didn't love it, but that didn't stop audiences.
Audiences, especially Bond fans, absolutely adored this new direction, this brave new direction.
With the film pulling in over $190 million, more than 4 times its $40 million budget. And most importantly,
it's up on the box office in comparison to A View to a Kill.
$50 million up.
Living Daylights was a big success.
Timothy Dalton had proven himself a worthy Bond successor. And for Cubby, he knew just what to do next.
The producers began developing a follow-up almost immediately, using the lessons of Timothy Dalton's incarnation of Bond.
John Glenn was back on board to direct his 5th Bond film.
We toughened the films up. We thought we can do better.
More gritty, more realistic, even more so than The Living Daylights.
You do not kill without reason.
They wanted it to have a lot more flair this time round.
They saw that he was a much more serious actor. He wasn't as light with the one-liners as Roger.
Little present for you. Not enough?
They decided they were going to make him a darker character in the next Bond film.
Make a sound. And you're dead.
Instead of echoing Star Wars as in Moonraker, they said, you know what? Miami Vice is hot. Let's do a drug story.
You take them now?
No. Stay with the man.
And so the idea for License to Kill was born. A gritty drama with Bond on a mission of revenge. However, Studio MGM wasn't prepared to invest blockbuster-size amounts of money to ensure that they had a blockbuster.
The problem was MGM were trying to economize on the cost of these films.
MGM, by now, was faltering.
In those 10 years I was making them, the budgets all stayed around $30 million, which by, today's standards is dirt cheap, quite honestly. And Cubby was under increasing pressure from the studio heads at that time. We resented it a bit.
An unhealthy resentment that would follow them all the way to Mexico City, where shooting on License to Kill began.
When they shot the first sequence, Cubby Broccoli is taken ill due to altitude sickness.
We had to repatriate him. We had to lay on a plane, get him back to LA for treatment.
With Cubby incapacitated, the producing responsibility fell to Cubby's stepson, Michael G. Wilson, and his daughter, Barbara Broccoli, both of whom were more than ready to step up.
Barbara, she sort of grew up on the Bonds. They'd been pretty hands-on all the way through.
Cubby's health returned, but when License to Kill hit the screens...
License to Kill is up against some pretty tough competition.
It comes out the same summer as Batman.
You've got Indiana Jones and Last Crusade, you've got Lethal Weapon 2.
The film did well by Hollywood standards, almost 5 times the film's $40 million budget. But by Bond standards, it failed to hit the high notes of previous films.
It just didn't quite live up to what audiences wanted. And unfortunately, License to Kill's, it's the end of the era.
Then you have my resignation.
Timothy Dalton's future as Bond appeared to be in the doldrums.
Effective immediately.
License to Kill's performance at the box office gave it the dubious honor of being the least commercially successful Bond film at the time, prompting a change in direction for the franchise.
Trade papers started to write, maybe this thing is all done, maybe its time has passed, look, people aren't seeing it.
It was a bit too hard. I think the subject was too hard for people to swallow.
But where would the franchise go after License to Kill?
Timothy Dalton was signed for 4 Bond films.
So after going serious spy thriller,
it is deemed that the production should refresh itself.
Cubby Broccoli thought maybe it was a good idea to bring back the girls and gadgets.
Inside, a tear gas cartridge. That goes in the case against the side here like that.
There were 2 different versions of Timothy Dalton's third Bond.
A TV writer of Miami Vice, Alphonse Ruggiero Jr. is hired.
Broccoli read it and said, that's the best Bond opener we've ever had.
There were robots involved. Not just robots, drones. Bond jumps out of a building and holds onto a drone and rides it down to the ground because the drone fails from his weight. Great idea.
Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said for the rest of the script.
Seemingly somewhat Die Hard inspired, which had been the big hit of 1988.
Come out to the coast, we'll get together, have a few laughs.
It involves various unique and novel technologies.
There was a sex robot. This is prefiguring Austin Powers by like a decade. But how weird would that have been for a Bond villain to be making love to a robot?
Hello, hello.
Hello, Mr. Powers. Mr. Powers.
Really strange stuff, even for the Bond series.
Another group of writers were brought in, Davies and Osborne. They had written Twins, and they took the script in a different direction.
A different direction that they spent years trying to avoid.
And that was that the character of James Bond was a little bit past his prime and a little too old for this stuff.
Old Man Bond, indeed.
It became more of an action comedy. And that has Bond going to a rodeo and wearing a cowboy hat. Actually, the idea of seeing Timothy Dalton in a cowboy hat, it kind of tickles me.
But before James Bond could get to his first rodeo, the entire franchise was thrown off the horse by Bond's ultimate villain, the bean counters.
The financial situation at MGM United Artists collapses in on itself.
MGM is in trouble again by the late 1980s.
They are purchased by a gentleman named Giancarlo Peretti.
But it was far from a straightforward purchase because Peretti was very well aware of the massive stake in the Bond franchise that he'd received if the purchase went through. All thanks
Harry sells to United Artists.
to when Harry Saltzman sold his 50% share to the studio years ago. And now, Peretti used that potential share as collateral to help fund the purchase.
Peretti, in order to finance it, had promised the rights to Bond TV output to other parties at a knockdown rate, therefore negatively impacting Cubby Broccoli.
It was a brazen act, and Cubby Broccoli would not go down without a fight. And along with his stepson, Michael G. Wilson, the real battle of the Bonds commenced.
There was a battle between MGM and Cubby.
Cubby Broccoli saw that the Bond revenues were being diverted from under him and sued in order to recover that situation.
It was a battle for the ages. Broccoli versus the studio.
A lot of money involved and a lot of control involved.
Perhaps this time, Cubby Broccoli had met his match.
Around about this time of legal tumult, there was a press announcement headed by Bond publicists that Broccoli was looking to sell the Bond franchise for approximately $200 million.